The uncomfortable silence stretched across the conference room like a dense, suffocating fog. Tinted glass windows from floor to ceiling revealed a gleaming New York skyline under the afternoon sun, but inside, the tension was palpable. Robert Wilson, CEO of Ecotech Innovations, watched with growing desperation as his dreams and years of work crumbled before his eyes. The Chinese delegation, headed by the imposing Mr. Zhang, exchanged impatient glances. Their briefcases already closed on the gleaming mahogany table suggested an imminent departure. The contracted interpreter had not shown up, and time, that resource that Robert had learned to value more than money, was inexorably slipping away. "I deeply apologize, gentlemen," Robert said in halting English, knowing that his words barely scratched the surface of what he needed to communicate. "We're trying to resolve this inconvenience." In the farthest corner of the room, a middle-aged woman carefully mopped the floor. Elena Martinez, in her worn blue uniform with her hair pulled back in a simple bun, seemed invisible to everyone present, as those who clean the spaces where the fate of the world is decided often are. Mr. Zhang rose with determination. "This is a great waste of our time," he stated in Mandarin. "We expected professionalism. We're leaving." Elena looked up from the floor. Her hands, reddened from years of hard work, paused over the mop. She swallowed hard, hesitated for a moment, and then did the unthinkable. "Honorable Mr. Zhang," she said in impeccable Mandarin, "I beg you to consider that this small setback does not reflect the dedication and vision of Ecotech Innovations. Mr. Wilson has worked tirelessly on this project that will benefit both your company and the environment." The silence that followed was different from the previous one. It was the silence of absolute astonishment. All eyes converged on the cleaning woman who had just spoken with the fluency of a native. Sometimes, Elena thought as everyone stared at her, life puts us exactly where we need to be, even when we seem out of place. And perhaps the talents we hide out of fear are precisely those destined to change not only our own story, but also the stories of those around us. Elena Martinez had developed a special art of going unnoticed. After 15 years cleaning offices in some of New York's most impressive buildings, she had perfected the technique of moving like a shadow among hurried executives and important meetings. At 52, with hair beginning to silver at the temples and a slightly hunched posture from years of physical work, she had become part of the furniture, necessary but invisible. That May morning had begun like any other. She had awakened at 4, made a strong coffee in her small apartment in Queens, and taken 2 buses to reach the glass skyscraper where she worked. The building, headquarters to several multinational corporations, was a world apart from her own. "Morning, Elena," greeted Joe, the security guard, one of the few who bothered to know her name. "Good morning," she replied with a tired smile as she clocked in. What no one in that building knew, what Elena had kept as her best-guarded secret, was that behind that woman in the blue uniform and comfortable shoes hid a privileged mind and an extraordinary history. Elena didn't just speak English and Spanish. She mastered French, Italian, Portuguese, German, Russian, and Mandarin with a fluency that would have astonished any linguist. While cleaning the executive floor bathrooms, she recalled her previous life. She had been a linguistics professor at Columbia University, specializing in Asian languages, before an economic crisis and a series of painful personal circumstances dragged her into a downward spiral. "Elena, we need you up on the 42nd floor," her supervisor Lisa told her, interrupting her thoughts. "They've requested urgent cleaning for the main conference room. Apparently there's an important meeting with Chinese investors." Elena nodded without protest. Although she had already cleaned 3 complete floors that morning, her life had become a succession of orders obeyed without question in an effort to maintain the invisibility that protected her. As she rode up in the service elevator, she thought of her daughter, Jessica. Everything she did, every floor scrubbed, every toilet cleaned, was for her. At 23, Jessica was about to graduate from medical school, fulfilling the dream that Elena had had to abandon, a university education and a bright future. If Elena had to disappear so that her daughter could shine, it was a price she was willing to pay. Upon arriving at the conference room, Elena immediately sensed the tension. Robert Wilson, whom she recognized from having seen him in business magazines and in the building corridors, seemed on the verge of a nervous collapse. The Chinese delegation maintained impassive expressions. but their body language revealed impatience. Elena began to clean discreetly, catching fragments of conversation. She understood that the interpreter had not arrived, and that the deal, a renewable energy project valued in the millions, was about to vanish. When Mr. Zhang announced his intention to leave in Mandarin, something stirred inside Elena. She thought of all the times she had heard Robert Wilson speak passionately about clean energy while she emptied his trash can, believing her incapable of understanding the complexity of his ideas. She thought of her daughter, who dreamed of a better world, and for the first time in many years she decided to make herself visible. The words in Mandarin flowed naturally from her mouth, like a river finally breaking a dam. The expression of amazement on Mr. Zhang's face was only surpassed by the absolute incredulity in Robert Wilson's eyes. "You speak Mandarin?" Mr. Zhang asked, scrutinizing her with renewed interest. "Yes, Honorable Sir," Elena replied with a respectful bow, "and I would be honored to assist in this meeting if I may." Robert Wilson, recovering from his initial surprise, approached Elena with a mixture of desperation and hope. "Can you really help us?" he asked in English, as if he needed to confirm he wasn't dreaming. Elena nodded, feeling something within her awakening after a long dormancy. "I can translate for you," she said simply, "if you give me the opportunity." Robert Wilson had built ecotech innovations from scratch, transforming a small startup into one of the most promising companies in the renewable energy sector. At 45, he projected the perfect image of a successful executive: tailored suits, a penthouse in Upper East Side, and the relentless determination of someone accustomed to getting what he wants. But that morning, as he watched Elena Martinez, the cleaning lady, translate with absolute precision the complex technical terms of the agreement, he felt something he rarely experienced: vulnerability. "Please tell them that our solar panel system uses patented technology that increases efficiency by 30% compared to conventional models," Robert instructed Elena, studying her face as she transformed his words into fluent Mandarin. "Mr. Zhang and his team nodded with approval, asking technical questions that Elena translated with a precision that left Robert perplexed. The meeting, which had been on the verge of collapse, extended for 3 productive hours. When the Chinese investors finally said goodbye with smiles and handshakes, Mr. Zhang addressed Elena specifically. "It has been a pleasure to meet someone who speaks our language with such respect for its nuances," he told her. "We hope to see you again in future negotiations." Elena translated his words for Robert, omitting the personal compliments. Once alone in the conference room, the silence became uncomfortable. Elena, suddenly aware of her uniform and her position, began to gather her cleaning equipment. "Wait," said Robert, gently blocking her path. "I need to understand what just happened here." Elena looked up, meeting Robert's intense dark eyes. For an instant, she saw something beyond the facade of the successful businessman. She saw uncertainty, curiosity, and perhaps a glimmer of admiration. "I simply did my job, sir. A different one than usual, but a job nonetheless," she replied, with a dignity that surprised Robert. "How is it possible that he began, stopping as he realized how his question would sound. "A cleaning woman speaks Mandarin," Eleanor completed, with a slightly ironic smile. "Life takes many turns, Mr. Wilson. We are not always what we appear to be." Robert ran a hand through his perfectly combed hair, slightly disheveling it. This gesture, small but revealing, showed Elena a crack in his armor of perfection. "What I mean is that you just saved a $50 million deal, and I have no idea who you really are." What Robert did not reveal at that moment, what he concealed behind his apparent confidence, was that he himself understood perfectly what it meant to be judged by appearances. Born in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, the son of a construction worker and a seamstress, he had reinvented every aspect of himself: his accent, his manners, even his way of walking. He had built himself as one builds a building, brick by brick, carefully hiding the humble foundations on which he stood. "My name is Elena Martinez," she said simply. "I've been cleaning in this building for 5 years. Before that," she hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Before that I had another life." Robert looked at her with renewed intensity. There was something about this woman that defied all his expectations, that destabilized him in a disturbing yet intriguing way. I need you to help me with more meetings, he said finally. Not as cleaning staff, but as an interpreter. I'll pay you double what you earn now. Eleanor held his gaze. Triple, she said, with a confidence that surprised them both. And I want a formal contract that acknowledges my translation services. An almost imperceptible smile formed on Robert's lips. He extended his hand. Deal, Ms. Martinez. I think you've just begun a new chapter in your life. What neither of them could imagine was how profoundly true that statement would prove to be, not only for Elena, but also for Robert himself, whose carefully constructed facade would begin to crack in the face of this extraordinary woman's authenticity. The office assigned to Elena on the executive floor was small but elegant, with panoramic windows that momentarily took her breath away. It was strange to find herself on the other side of the glass, being part of the world she had observed for years while cleaning. It's temporary until we find a more suitable space, explained Susan Miller, the efficient human resources assistant who was guiding her through her new environment. Here's your contract, access card, and system credentials. Mr. Wilson has requested that you be operational as soon as possible. Elena observed the corporate ID card with her name and the designation International Communications Consultant. It seemed to belong to another person, to a version of herself she had abandoned long ago. Thank you, she murmured, still assimilating the dizzying change she had experienced in the last 24 hours. Susan gave her a professional smile. Mr. Wilson can be utterly demanding, but he values talent. He clearly saw something special in you. Once alone, Eleanor touched the polished wooden desk, the elegant empty bookshelves, the latest model computer. She felt like an intruder, an imposter about to be discovered. She took out her mobile phone, an old model with a cracked screen, and called her daughter. Mom, are you okay? Jessica's voice sounded worried. Eleanor rarely called during her working hours. I'm fine, honey. Better than fine, actually. Something unexpected has happened. As she related the events of the previous day, Eleanor listened to her daughter's exclamations of amazement. Jessica was the only person who knew Eleanor's complete story, her past as an academic, the circumstances that had led her to abandon everything. This is your opportunity, Mom. I always knew that someday the world would see how extraordinary you are. Jessica's unwavering faith moved her, but also intensified her anxiety. I don't know if I'm ready for this. It's been so long. You're more than ready, Jessica affirmed with the certainty of youth. Besides, you've already proven your worth. You just need to remember it yourself. After hanging up, Eleanor opened the computer and began to familiarize herself with the project documents. The technical terminology was unfamiliar to her, but her mind, trained in linguistics, quickly grasped the patterns and structures. She immersed herself in the work, losing track of time, until a voice startled her. I see you're adapting quickly. Robert Wilson was leaning on the doorframe, observing her with an indecipherable expression. He wore a dark grey suit that, Elena was sure, cost more than all her furniture combined. I'm trying to catch up, she replied, suddenly conscious of her cheap blouse and worn shoes. Robert entered the office, examining the space as if seeing it for the first time. You'll need an appropriate wardrobe for meetings. Susan will coordinate with our image consultant. Elena tensed. I would prefer to take care of my appearance myself, thank you. Something in her tone made Robert look at her with renewed interest. He wasn't accustomed to being contradicted, especially by new employees. As you wish, but remember that in these meetings you represent ecotech innovations. I perfectly understand the importance of appearances, Mr. Wilson, Elena replied, holding his gaze. But true communication transcends the clothes one wears. To her surprise, Robert smiled slightly. Touché, Ms. Martinez. I suppose your linguistic skills are not limited to foreign languages. A silence loaded with meaning settled between them. Elena had the strange sensation that they were having two simultaneous conversations, one superficial and another deeper, full of mutual evaluations. We have a video conference with Berlin tomorrow at 9, Robert said finally. I prepared a guide with key terms in German. Of course, they will also speak English, but it's a courtesy gesture they'll appreciate. Of course, I'll familiarize myself with the material. Robert nodded, but he didn't leave immediately. He seemed to want to say something more. Ms. Martinez, he began finally with a slightly less formal tone, I believe I owe you an apology for my initial reaction yesterday. It was... revealing of certain prejudices that don't make me proud. The unexpected sincerity of his words surprised Eleanor. She sensed that this type of confession was not usual for him. We all have prejudices, Mr. Wilson. The important thing is being willing to question them. Robert looked at her thoughtfully. You're right. Well, I'll let you work. My assistant David is available if you need anything. He's efficient, though somewhat territorial. After Robert left, Elena remained reflecting on this complex and contradictory man. Under his appearance of absolute confidence, she had detected something familiar. The constant effort of someone who fears being discovered, of someone who, like her, perhaps wasn't exactly who they appeared to be. The meeting room was illuminated by the soft morning light filtering through partially open blinds. Eleanor, dressed in a navy blue suit that she had hastily purchased at a downtown store, felt as if she were playing a role in a theatrical production. The video conference with the German executives had begun punctually. Robert introduced Eleanor as our international communications expert, a title that made her feel simultaneously flattered and an imposter. It's a pleasure to meet you, Elena said in fluent German, observing the expressions of surprise and approval on the faces of the executives on the screen. The meeting progressed smoothly. Elena translated with precision, occasionally adding cultural nuances that softened the communication. She noticed how Robert observed her sidelong, evidently impressed by her poise. When the call ended, Robert reclined in his chair with a satisfied expression. Impeccable, he said simply. They were delighted, especially when you mentioned that German proverb about sustainability. Eleanor felt a spark of pride that she hadn't experienced in years. It's important to connect on a cultural level, not just linguistic. The door opened abruptly, and a man in his 30s entered, impeccably dressed and with an expression of calculated efficiency. The reports you requested, Robert, he said, deliberately ignoring Elena's presence. And Mr. Morales has called 3 times. It seems urgent. Thank you, David, Robert responded. Let me introduce Elena Martinez, our new consultant. David Parker slowly turned to Elena, evaluating her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ah, yes, the multilingual cleaning woman. A pleasure. The condescending tone made Elena tense, but she maintained a friendly expression. Likewise. David is my personal assistant, explained Robert, apparently oblivious to the tension. He's been with me since the company's beginnings. I couldn't function without him. Certainly not, confirmed David with a tense smile. Robert trusts me for everything. We're like family. Elena caught the implicit message. She was an intruder, a passing novelty. David clearly perceived her as a threat. We need to prepare the presentation for the Japanese investors, Robert continued. Elena, could you review the translation the agency sent us? I have a feeling there are nuances being lost. Of course, she nodded. I thought we would hire a professional translator for that, David intervened with fake innocence, someone with formal credentials. An uncomfortable silence settled in the room. Robert frowned and Elena felt she was being evaluated. Credentials are important, she responded calmly, but experience is too. I trust my work will speak for itself. Robert nodded, apparently satisfied with her response. Exactly. Results are what count in this company. When they were alone, Elena noticed a subtle change in Robert's expression, as if he partially removed a mask. Excuse David, he said with a sigh. He is extremely loyal, but sometimes too protective. Elena recognized the opportunity to establish the boundaries of their professional relationship. I understand office dynamics, Mr. Wilson. Don't worry about me. I've survived much more hostile environments. Robert looked at her with renewed curiosity. It seems so. You know, there's something that deeply intrigues me about you, Ms. Martinez. It's not just your mastery of languages. It's your composure. You don't seem intimidated by any of this. Eleanor carefully chose her words. Perhaps because I've learned that environments, however impressive they may seem, are just that. Environments. People are much more complex than the spaces we inhabit. For an instant, Elena thought she saw a flash of recognition in Robert's eyes, as if she had touched a truth that he too intimately knew. Philosophy besides linguistics. Interesting, he murmured. You know, I think you should accompany me to dinner with the Japanese team tonight, not just as an interpreter, but as an observer. Sometimes, what isn't said is as important as what is openly expressed. Eleanor hesitated. She thought of Jessica, with whom she had planned to have dinner that night. "It's an important opportunity," Robert added, correctly interpreting her hesitation. "And I assure you that the compensation will reflect the extra hours." "It's not a question of money," Elena responded honestly. "I had personal plans, but I can rearrange them." As she returned to her small office, Elena encountered David in the hallway. His smile was professional, but his eyes remained cold. "A friendly piece of advice," he said, subtly blocking her path. "Don't let yourself be dazzled by all this attention. I've seen Robert get excited about new talents before. The novelty always passes." Eleanor held his gaze unflinchingly. "I appreciate your concern, David, but I think we both know I'm not here for the novelty." "No?" His smile became sharper. "Then why are you here exactly? A woman of your background, suddenly in a position of influence." "It's curious, to say the least." "I'm here to do a job," Elena replied calmly. "The same reason you should be at your desk instead of intimidating new employees." Something in her tone, perhaps the natural authority she had developed during her years as a university professor, made David step back slightly. "I'm just trying to protect the company's interests," he said, regaining his composure. "And Robert's." "Our interests are aligned then," Elena concluded, circling around him to continue on her way. As she walked away, she felt David's gaze drilling into her back. She had recognized something dangerous in him, not just ambition, but the desperate fear of someone afraid of losing their privileged position. Eleanor knew from bitter experience that there was no more relentless adversary than a frightened person. The dinner with the Japanese investors took place at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, an establishment with minimalist architecture and exorbitant prices that made Elena feel deeply out of place. Seated next to Robert, she observed the display of etiquette and power with the same attention she devoted to the exchanged words. "Your proposal about implementing solar panels in rural areas seems especially interesting to us," she commented in Japanese to Mr. Tanaka, the leader of the delegation. The man in his 60s with a serene expression raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Your mastery of our language is impressive, Ms. Martinez," he replied. "Where did you learn it?" Elena felt Robert's attentive gaze, who, despite not understanding the conversation, was clearly monitoring reactions. "I studied at Kyoto University for 2 years," Elena explained, "a life-changing experience." Mr. Tanaka's expression brightened. "What a coincidence. My daughter is currently studying there." "During what period were you there?" Elena calculated quickly. Revealing that it was almost 30 years ago might generate uncomfortable questions about her subsequent trajectory. "Some time ago already," she replied diplomatically, "but the cherry blossoms remain one of my most precious memories." Mr. Tanaka nodded appreciatively, and the conversation flowed toward business topics. Elena translated for Robert, who handled the negotiations with elegant precision. Observing him, Elena noticed revealing small details, the way he slightly tensed his jaw when a delicate point arose, the subtle adjustment of his posture when he wanted to project more authority. "Tell them we're willing to adapt the system for the specific conditions of Hokkaido," Robert indicated at a crucial moment in the conversation. Eleanor translated his words but added a small cultural nuance, mentioning how this approach resonated with the Japanese concept of kaizen, or continuous improvement. The subtle addition provoked smiles of approval. When the Japanese executives temporarily excused themselves, Robert leaned toward Eleanor. "It's amazing," he murmured. "You not only translate my words, but you improve them." "What exactly did you add that made them react so positively?" Elena explained the concept of kaizen and how she had established a cultural bridge. Robert looked at her with renewed curiosity. "Kyoto University? You never mentioned you had lived in Japan." "There are many things I haven't mentioned, Mr. Wilson," she replied with an enigmatic smile. "I didn't consider it relevant to share my complete history." "On the contrary, it's extremely relevant," he countered, leaning in closer. "You're not simply a person who speaks languages. You're a true intercultural communicator. That's an invaluable asset for a company with global ambitions." Eleanor felt a contradictory mixture of pride and wariness. Being valued for her true skills was gratifying after years of invisibility, but also dangerous. Each revelation about her past opened the door to questions she preferred to avoid. Mr. Tanaka returned, accompanied not only by his colleagues but by an older man Elena hadn't seen before. To her horror, she recognized Professor Watanabe, her former mentor in Kyoto, now considerably aged but unmistakable. "Let me introduce Professor Watanabe, an advisor to our board of directors and a specialist in renewable energies," announced Mr. Tanaka. Eleanor instinctively lowered her gaze, hoping not to be recognized after so many years, but fate had other plans. "Elena?" "Elena Martinez." Professor Watanabe's voice vibrated with astonishment. "I can't believe it. After all these years." Robert observed the exchange with growing interest, sensing the evident tension, although he didn't understand the words. "Professor Watanabe," Elena greeted formally in Japanese. "What a surprise to find you here." "A wonderful surprise," exclaimed the elderly professor. "I always wondered what had become of my most brilliant student. We all expected you to return to occupy the chair I left vacant." Elena briefly translated for Robert, omitting the reference to the chair. "An old professor of mine," she explained, trying to downplay the encounter. Professor Watanabe addressed Robert in halting English. "Mr. Wilson, you have a treasure on your team. This woman was the most promising scholar in applied linguistics I've ever known. Her thesis on intercultural communication in diplomatic contexts is still a reference in our department." Robert looked at Elena with an indecipherable expression, while she felt her carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. "Interesting," Robert responded slowly. "Ms. Martinez has been quite reserved regarding her academic past." "Academic?" The professor seemed confused. "Elena was destined for a brilliant career. She received offers from Harvard, Oxford. Everyone wanted the young language prodigy." The rest of the dinner proceeded in a precarious balance. Elena maintained her professionalism, translating accurately and facilitating the agreement, but she felt Robert's evaluative gaze constantly upon her. In the return journey, in Robert's luxurious chauffeured car, the silence became oppressive until he finally broke it. "So," he began with a neutral tone, "from academia to cleaning. There must be a fascinating story between those 2 points." Eleanor looked out the window, watching New York streets glide by in the night. "Everyone has a past, Mr. Wilson. Some of us prefer to leave them behind." "Some pasts shouldn't be left behind," he replied with unexpected gentleness, "especially those that demonstrate exceptional talent." Eleanor turned to look at him directly. In the dim light of the car's interior, Robert seemed different, less the relentless executive and more a genuinely intrigued man. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "You have what you need. A competent interpreter who is helping you close important deals." Robert held her gaze. "Because I recognize someone who is hiding, and I wonder exactly what they're running from." The observation, so accurate and personal, momentarily disarmed Elena. She felt the dangerous impulse to be sincere, to share the cascade of events that had led her from a promising academic career to cleaning offices. But the habit of caution prevailed. "We all hide from something, don't you think?" she finally responded. "Even those who seem to have nothing to conceal." An enigmatic smile curved Robert's lips. "Touché, Ms. Martinez. It seems we have more in common than anyone might imagine." The car stopped in front of the modest apartment building where Eleanor lived, a marked contrast to the elegant neighborhood they had left behind. "Thank you for your excellent work tonight," Robert said formally, recovering his professional tone. "The deal is practically closed thanks to you." Eleanor nodded, grateful for the return to safer ground. "I'm glad to have been useful." As she opened the door, Robert added, "By the way, I'm organizing a charity gala next week. I'd like you to attend. There will be international guests, and your presence would be valuable." Elena hesitated, recognizing the invitation for what it was, another step towards a world she wasn't sure she wanted to return to. "I'll think about it," she replied, knowing she would probably accept. Not out of ambition or the attraction of glamour, but something deeper and more disturbing. The growing sensation that, after years of invisibility, someone truly saw her. The luxury clothing store in the Upper East Side was a temple dedicated to exclusivity. Stylized mannequins displayed garments whose prices Elena preferred not to know, while attendants with measured smiles discreetly evaluated each potential customer. "This is absurd," Elena murmured to Jessica, who had reluctantly accompanied her. "I could pay a month's rent with what that dress costs." Jessica, with her 23 years and the confidence typical of youth, affectionately rolled her eyes. "It's an investment, Mom. You need to look like the professional you are for that gala." Eleanor observed her daughter with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Jessica, with her 5'7" frame, dark hair and intense eyes inherited from her father, attracted admiring glances even in her worn jeans and university t-shirt. She represented everything Eleanor had sacrificed to protect, the reason behind each of her difficult decisions. "I don't need an expensive dress to be professional," Elena protested, though without conviction. Deep down, she knew that appearances mattered in the world she was returning to, a world where being heard often depended on being seen in the right way. A salesperson approached with a studied smile. "May I help you?" Before Elena could respond, Jessica intervened with surprising authority. "My mother needs a dress for a corporate gala, something elegant but not ostentatious. She's a linguistic consultant for Ecotech Innovations." The mention of the company subtly changed the attendant's attitude, whose smile became more genuine. "Of course, we have several options that would be perfect. May I show you?" 2 hours later, Elena looked at herself in the three-way mirror, barely recognizing herself. The black dress, simply cut but impeccably tailored, transformed her figure with an elegance she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't ostentatious but radiated quality and contained sophistication. "This is the one," Jessica declared with certainty. "You look like yourself but the best possible version." Elena studied her reflection, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. The dress cost more than she had spent on clothes in the past 2 years combined, but the effect was undeniable. She didn't look like a cleaning woman playing at being an executive. She looked like the professional she once had been, and perhaps could be again. "All right," she finally conceded. "This one." As the salesperson processed the purchase, Jessica squeezed her mother's hand. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "I always knew someday the world would see what I see." Eleanor hugged her daughter, containing the emotion that threatened to overflow. She hadn't been entirely truthful with Jessica about the circumstances of her promotion at Ecotech. Her daughter assumed her superiors had gradually discovered her abilities, not that it had been an impulsive act during a crisis. "Will you tell me the complete story someday?" Jessica suddenly asked, as if she had read her thoughts. "What story?" Eleanor tried to sound casual. "The one about how you went from being a respected professor to cleaning offices." Jessica's eyes, so similar to her own, looked at her with determination. "You've always told me it was because of the economic crisis, but I know there's more. I have the right to know why I grew up watching my mother do a job that was far below her capabilities." The moment Eleanor had feared for years had finally arrived. She sighed deeply. "You're right," she admitted. "There is more to that story. And you deserve to know it. But not here, not now. I promise I'll tell you everything soon." Jessica nodded, accepting the promise. "I'll hold you to that. And Mom, whatever it is, it won't change how I feel about you." Robert Wilson's office occupied the privileged corner of the building, with large windows on 2 walls that offered a panoramic view of New York. Elena, summoned for a private meeting, observed the space that perfectly reflected its occupant, orderly, impressive, and carefully designed to intimidate. "Please, sit down," Robert indicated, motioning to the leather sofa instead of the chairs in front of his desk, a gesture suggesting a less formal conversation. Eleanor took a seat, aware of the tension in the atmosphere. Since the dinner with the Japanese and the unexpected appearance of Professor Watanabe, she had perceived a change in Robert's attitude toward her, a more intense curiosity, almost personal. "I've reviewed the contract with the Japanese," he began, sitting in the armchair opposite her. "They've included 2 additional clauses that weren't in our initial agreement." Eleanor waited, intuiting that he hadn't called her just to discuss contractual clauses. "The interesting thing," Robert continued, "is that these clauses benefit us considerably. They specifically mention continuity in intercultural communication as a key factor for the project's development." "That's a sensible consideration," Eleanor commented cautiously. Robert leaned slightly forward. "In other words, Ms. Martinez, they want you. Not just any interpreter, but specifically you." Eleanor felt a mixture of professional pride and apprehension. I'm flattered, but— Which leads me, Robert interrupted, to wonder who you really are. The silence that followed was dense, loaded with implications. Eleanor maintained a neutral expression, though her heart had accelerated. I think you already know, she finally responded. I'm Elena Martinez, former academic, former university professor, former many things. Currently your interpreter. Robert studied her intensely. I've done a bit of research. I hope you don't mind. Elena Martinez, PhD in Applied Linguistics from Columbia University, specialist in intercultural communication, visiting professor at Kyoto, Oxford, and the Sorbonne, author of 2 books on negotiation in multicultural contexts. He made a significant pause. And then nothing. You completely disappear from the academic world 15 years ago. Eleanor felt the air becoming denser. I see you've been thorough. What I haven't been able to find, he continued, ignoring her comment, is why a brilliant academic with a promising career abandons everything to end up cleaning offices. The direct question, formulated with a mixture of genuine curiosity and a certain reproach, hit Elena like a slap. She considered lying, creating a sanitized version of her story, but something in Robert's gaze suggested he wouldn't settle for less than the truth. Life rarely follows clean and orderly trajectories, Mr. Wilson, Elena began, carefully choosing her words, especially for those of us who weren't born with safety nets. Robert raised an eyebrow, intrigued. 15 years ago, I returned from a sabbatical year in Japan to find that my position at the university had been eliminated due to budget cuts. Simultaneously, my marriage disintegrated when I discovered that my husband had accumulated considerable debts behind my back. Elena paused, the memories still painful after so much time. I had a young daughter, debts that weren't mine, and suddenly, no income. But with your credentials, surely you could have found another academic position, objected Robert. Elena smiled humorlessly. In theory, yes. In practice, I was in the middle of an economic crisis, where universities were cutting staff, not hiring. Additionally, my ex-husband had complicated my professional reputation. Complicated? Elena breathed deeply. He was also an academic. When I confronted him about the debts, he responded with accusations of plagiarism against me. False, of course, but damaging enough to create doubts. In the academic world, even suspicion is lethal. Robert observed her with an inscrutable expression. So you lost everything? Not everything, Eleanor corrected firmly. I never lost my dignity or my ability to protect my daughter. I accepted the first job I found, then another, and another. Eventually, I discovered that cleaning allowed me to be invisible, earn a decent salary with hours that allowed me to be with my daughter, and avoid questions about my past. Until you decided to become visible again, concluded Robert. Elena held his gaze. It wasn't a calculated decision, it was instinctive. Robert reclined in his seat, processing her story. You know what I find most intriguing, Ms. Martinez? It's not that you fell so low, but that you remained there so long having your capabilities. The observation, though not intended to be cruel, prickled a sensitive point. Sometimes, Mr. Wilson, what seems like a lack of ambition is simply survival. Not all of us can afford the luxury of pursuing our dreams when there are bills to pay and people who depend on us. Something changed in Robert's expression, a flash of what seemed like recognition, perhaps even respect. Touché again, he murmured. Then, changing to a more professional tone, the Japanese want you to lead the communication for the entire project. This means a much more permanent and prominent role. Are you prepared for that? The question was more complex than it seemed. Elena understood that Robert was not only asking about her professional capabilities, but about her willingness to fully return to the visible world, to abandon the safety of the shadows. Do I have a choice? She asked sincerely. Robert smiled slightly. There are always choices, Elena. The question is, which ones we're willing to accept. It was the first time he had called her by her first name, a small change that signaled a shift in their relationship. In that case, she responded, I'm prepared. Robert nodded, satisfied. Excellent. Let's prepare your formal presentation at the charity gala then. It will be your official introduction to the executive team and our most important partners. As Elena rose to leave, Robert casually added, By the way, my daughter returns from London tomorrow. She'll be at the gala. I should warn you that she can be difficult. Difficult? Distrustful, especially with new incorporations that seemed to quickly earn my trust. His tone was light, but his eyes communicated a genuine warning. Emily is brilliant, but protective. She's seen too many people trying to take advantage of our position. Elena nodded, understanding. Thank you for the warning. I'll try not to represent a threat. It's not about that, Robert corrected. It's about being authentic. Emily has an exceptional radar for detecting falsehood. Just be who you are, Elena. It's worked pretty well so far. As she left the office, Eleanor reflected on the irony of his advice. Being who she really was precisely what she had avoided for 15 years. And now that authenticity she had so feared showing seemed to be the key to her new life. The hotel where the charity gala was being held was an architectural gem in historic Manhattan, a converted old mansion that mixed classical elements with modern touches. Eleanor, arriving in a taxi instead of the limousine that transported most guests, paused a moment at the entrance, admiring the illuminated facade while gathering courage. Her black dress, elegant in its simplicity, provided a confidence she hadn't felt in years. She had arranged her hair in a low bun and applied discreet makeup that enhanced her features without seeming excessive. The result, as Jessica had said, was herself, but in her best version. "Ticket, please," requested a young man in a tuxedo at the entrance. Eleanor presented the digital invitation Robert had sent her. The young man nodded respectfully and indicated the way to the main hall. The interior was even more impressive. Vaulted ceilings with restored frescoes, crystal chandeliers that spilled golden light over the attendees, and monumental floral arrangements that perfumed the ambiance. New York's elite circulated with the familiarity of those who regularly inhabit these spaces, exchanging greetings, measured laughs, and comments about art, politics, and finance. Elena felt like an anthropologist studying a strange tribe. She had participated in prestigious academic events in the past, but the world of corporate power had its own codes and rituals, subtly different. "Elena," Robert's voice rescued her from her observations. He approached with a champagne flute in hand, impeccable in his tailored tuxedo. "I'm glad you could make it." "The place is impressive," she commented, accepting the glass he offered. "It was the Vanderbilt mansion. Now it's owned by an Arab hotel conglomerate," Robert explained with a certain irony. "Times change, though appearances remain." Elena caught the subtext of his comment. "Like so many things in life," Robert smiled, appreciating her insight. "Come, there are people you should meet." The next hour passed in a succession of introductions. Robert invariably introduced her as our brilliant director of intercultural communication, PhD in linguistics, and key to our recent international negotiations. Eleanor noticed the evaluative looks, the barely disguised curiosity about this new addition to Wilson's inner circle. "Your Spanish is excellent, but I detect a subtle Parisian accent," commented the Belgian ambassador in French, clearly pleased to find someone with whom to practice his language. "I spent a year as a visiting professor at the Sorbonne," Elena replied in the same language, surprised at how quickly her academic social skills were returning. "Fascinating. And what do you think of the new Franco-American energy project in the Midwest?" The conversation naturally flowed toward topics of sustainability and international cooperation. Elena found herself enjoying the intellectual exchange, something she had deeply missed during her years of isolation. Robert watched with pleasure, occasionally intervening but allowing her to shine. Eleanor caught his approving glance as she elegantly navigated a particularly complex conversation about European energy policies, alternating between French, English, and Spanish, according to the interlocutor. "Impressive," Robert murmured when they finally had a moment alone. "You've captivated half the European diplomatic cabinet in an hour." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. "It's like riding a bicycle. You never really forget. Am I interrupting something?" A female voice, cold and precise, cut through their moment of complicity. Elena turned to find a young woman in her late 20s, whose classic beauty was accentuated by a red dress that dramatically contrasted with her pale skin and black hair. Her eyes, identical to Robert's, studied her with barely disguised distrust. "Emily!" Robert embraced the newcomer with genuine affection. "I was looking for you. I want to introduce you to Elena Martinez, our new director of intercultural communication." "The famous polyglot," Emily responded, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dad hasn't talked about anything else lately. Elena extended her hand, maintaining a friendly expression. A pleasure to meet you, Emily. Your father speaks wonderfully of you. Emily shook her hand briefly. How curious. Just a month ago, he didn't mention anything about hiring a new director, especially one with such an unusual background. Robert frowned. Emily. No, please, Elena intervened calmly. It's a fair observation. My incorporation was quite sudden. Emily took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter's tray. Certainly. From cleaning to executive management in a month. Quite a success story, isn't it? The sarcastic tone was undeniable. Robert seemed about to intervene, but Elena gave him a reassuring look. Life rarely follows predictable trajectories, Emily, she responded with serenity. Sometimes we take detours before finding our true path. Or perhaps some are simply opportunists who know how to take advantage of circumstances, Emily countered, taking a sip of her champagne. Enough, Emily. Robert's voice acquired an authoritative edge. Elena has demonstrated invaluable worth to the company. I'd appreciate it if you showed the respect she deserves. A tense silence settled between them. Elena perceived the underlying family dynamic, the protective father, the daughter jealous of his attention, and herself as the intruder who threatened an already precarious balance. Don't worry, Robert, Elena said softly. I understand Emily's concern. It's natural to protect what one loves. Emily seemed momentarily disarmed by this response, as if she had expected defensiveness or anger. Before she could respond, they were interrupted by David, who approached with an urgent expression. Robert, the representatives from Green Investment Fund want to talk to you about the Gulf Coast project, he informed, giving the tense trio an evaluative look. Excuse me for a moment, Robert said, clearly reluctant to leave them alone but aware of his responsibilities. When Robert walked away, Eleanor expected Emily to excuse herself as well, but to her surprise, the young woman remained, observing her with renewed intensity. I'll be direct, Emily finally said, lowering her voice. I don't know exactly what you're after with my father, but you're mistaken if you think I'm naive. Elena remained calm. I'm not after anything besides doing my job, Emily, and I don't consider you naive at all. My father may be brilliant in business, but he has a blind spot when it comes to people who pretend to be what they're not. Emily took a step closer, her voice barely audible over the ambient music. I've researched you. There are gaps in your story, voids that have no explanation. A chill ran down Elena's back. We all have parts of our lives we prefer not to discuss publicly. True, but most don't mysteriously jump from respected university professor to cleaner, only to then reappear as a CEO's confidant. Emily tilted her head slightly. I wonder what I would find if I dug a bit deeper. The veiled threat hung between them like a toxic cloud. Elena considered her options. She could ignore the provocation, counterattack, or... Your father knows my story, Emily, she finally said, opting for sincerity. I have nothing to hide from him. If you want to know the details, perhaps you should ask him directly. This response seemed to surprise Emily. You expect me to believe you've told him everything, including why you really disappeared from the academic world? The implication that there was something more, something not even Robert knew, disturbed Elena. What exactly did Emily think she knew? The circumstances that led me to change my life were personal and painful, Elena replied, maintaining a composure she didn't feel. But there's no sinister secret, if that's what you're suggesting. Emily's gaze intensified. That remains to be seen. I'll just tell you one thing. My father has worked all his life to build this company. It's everything to him. If I discover you're taking advantage in any way... She didn't need to finish the threat. The message was clear. Your father is fortunate to have someone who protects him so fiercely, Eleanor said sincerely. But I assure you my intentions are honest. Emily seemed about to respond when a new voice interrupted their confrontation. Eleanor, what a wonderful surprise. Eleanor turned to find Margaret Davis, a former colleague from the university whom she hadn't seen in over a decade. The encounter, under any other circumstances, would have been a pleasant reunion. At that moment, under Emily's scrutinizing gaze, it felt like another potential complication. Margaret, Eleanor greeted, striving to maintain a casual tone. It's been a long time. Too long, Margaret hugged her effusively. Where have you been all these years? After that disaster with Paul and the accusations, you simply disappeared. Many of us tried to contact you." Eleanor felt the blood draining from her face. Of all the people she could have encountered, Margaret was perhaps the worst. A former friend who knew precisely the details Elena had tried to leave behind. Emily observed the exchange with predatory interest, clearly absorbing every word. "It was a difficult period," Eleanor responded vaguely. "I had to make some complicated decisions." "But now you're back," Margaret exclaimed, oblivious to the tension. "I always knew it was just a matter of time." After it was proven that Paul had falsified those documents and that the accusations were completely unfounded, many of us expected your return to academia. Elena noticed how Emily registered this information, visibly readjusting her theories. "Life took another path," Elena said, trying to conclude the conversation. "Margaret, let me introduce Emily Wilson, daughter of Robert Wilson, CEO of Ecotech Innovations." Margaret shook Emily's hand enthusiastically. "A pleasure. You are fortunate to have Elena on your team. She was the star of our department before that unpleasant business unjustly drove her away." "Fascinating," murmured Emily, her expression now more calculating than hostile. "I'd love to hear more about that period." Elena intervened before Margaret could elaborate. "Excuse us, but I see Robert signaling for me. Margaret, it's been wonderful to see you. Let's talk later, okay?" She walked away quickly, knowing she had left Emily with Margaret, a potentially dangerous combination, but preferring that risk to remaining trapped in a conversation that would reveal too much. Robert wasn't actually looking for her, of course, but Elena needed a moment to regain her composure. She headed toward one of the balconies that overlooked an interior garden illuminated with decorative torches. The fresh night air of Manhattan relieved the heat she felt in her cheeks. She breathed deeply, trying to calm the internal tumult. The past, which she had carefully buried, seemed to be emerging everywhere, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. "Are you okay?" Elena turned to find Robert at the balcony entrance, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Yes, I just needed a moment of quiet," she replied, striving to appear composed. Robert joined her at the railing. "I apologize for Emily's behavior. She's protective of me, sometimes excessively. It's understandable, she loves you." "Yes, though sometimes her love takes complicated forms." Robert looked down at the illuminated garden below. "I saw her talking with a woman after you left. They seemed to be having an intense conversation." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. "A former colleague from the university. I hadn't seen her in years." "And that disturbed you?" Robert asked directly. Elena considered lying, but something about the night, about the intimacy of that balcony, away from the bustle of the party, propelled her toward honesty. "There are parts of my story I haven't told you," she admitted. "Not because they're shameful or illegal, but because they're painful to remember." Robert looked at her with renewed intensity. "Does it have to do with those accusations you briefly mentioned? The ones your ex-husband made?" Elena nodded slowly. "Paul accused me of plagiarizing part of his work in an important article I published. It was completely false, but enough to create doubts at a time when my department was already cutting staff. It was devastating. But according to your friend, it was eventually proven that he had falsified the evidence," observed Robert. "Yes, 3 years later. By then I had already disappeared from the academic world, had adopted a new identity as Elena the Cleaner, invisible and safe." Her voice acquired a bitter tone. "The vindication came too late." Robert remained silent for a moment, respecting the weight of her confession. "Why didn't you return when the truth was known?" Eleanor looked toward the night, toward the stars barely visible above New York's glow. "Fear becomes a habit, Robert. After years living in the shadows, the idea of exposing myself again seemed unthinkable. Besides, my daughter was stable, adapted. What right did I have to turn her life upside down again for my ambition?" "It's not ambition to reclaim what legitimately belongs to you," Robert replied with an unusual gentleness. "It's justice." Elena looked at him, surprised by the understanding in his voice, by the absence of judgment she had expected. "Perhaps," she conceded. "But the decisions we make in moments of crisis define us as much as those we make in times of clarity." Robert nodded slowly. "I know something about reinventing oneself," he said, almost to himself. "About leaving behind a past that doesn't fit with who you need to be." There was something in his tone, a vulnerability Elena hadn't heard before, suggesting that Robert also kept secrets, parts of himself carefully hidden from the world he had conquered. "We should return," Elena suggested after a moment. "People will notice our absence." Robert smiled slightly. "They already are, especially since you've charmed half the European diplomatic corps." As they returned to the hall, Elena felt strangely light, as if sharing that small part of her truth had eased a weight she didn't even know she was carrying. And more surprisingly, she felt an unexpected connection with this complex man who, perhaps, understood more than he let on about the art of reinventing oneself. "The figures are clear," Robert declared, pointing to the graphs projected in the conference room. "The joint project with the Japanese will increase our production capacity by 40%, with a 20% reduction in the carbon footprint." Eleanor, seated to his right, discreetly translated some technical terms for Mr. Tanaka, who nodded with approval. After 6 weeks in her new position, she had become a constant presence in high-level meetings, not just as a translator but as a cultural advisor, anticipating potential misunderstandings and smoothing complicated interactions. "If I may," Elena intervened when Robert finished his presentation, "I'd like to point out an important cultural aspect regarding the implementation timeline." Robert gave her the floor with a gesture of confidence that didn't go unnoticed by those present. "In Japanese business culture," Elena explained, alternating between English and Japanese, "deadlines are considered absolute commitments. Our Western flexibility regarding delivery dates could be interpreted as a lack of seriousness. I suggest establishing slightly more conservative timeframes than usual to guarantee their exact fulfillment." Mr. Tanaka smiled, visibly pleased by the observation. "Ms. Martinez, your understanding of our mentality is refreshing. Many collaborations fail precisely because of these subtle differences." The meeting concluded in an atmosphere of optimism. As the Japanese executives said their goodbyes, Elena noticed Emily observing her from the back of the room, her expression indecipherable. Since the charity gala 2 weeks earlier, Emily's attitude toward her had changed. Open hostility had been replaced by cautious curiosity. Eleanor suspected that her conversation with Margaret had provided Emily with a different perspective, perhaps humanizing her in her eyes. "Excellent meeting," Robert commented when they were alone with the executive team. "The deal is practically closed thanks to the cultural perspective Elena has contributed." David, seated across from them, maintained a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No doubt. Although I wonder if we aren't conceding too much in the implementation timeframes." "We're not conceding, we're adapting," Robert corrected. "As Elena has rightly pointed out, it's about understanding and respecting fundamental cultural differences." Eleanor perceived the growing tension between Robert and his assistant. David, who had clearly expected to eventually occupy a managerial position, saw her incorporation as a threat to his aspirations. What had begun as professional wariness seemed to be evolving into something more personal, especially as Robert placed more trust in her. After the meeting, Elena returned to her office, now a considerably larger space than the initial cubicle, decorated with discreet elegance but functionality. She had allowed herself some personal touches. A photograph of Jessica at her recent graduation ceremony, a small bonsai tree that Robert had given her after the success of the negotiations with the Japanese, and, in an act of personal courage, her 2 academic books rescued from forgotten boxes in her apartment closet. She was reviewing documentation when she sensed a presence at the door. Emily Wilson was observing her, leaning on the frame with an evaluative expression. "Do you have a moment?" she asked in a tone that, though not warm, lacked the previous hostility. "Of course," Elena responded, indicating for her to enter. "How can I help you?" Emily closed the door behind her and took a seat across from Elena's desk. For a few seconds she simply observed her, as if deciding where to start. "I spoke with your friend Margaret at the gala," she finally said, direct as always. "She told me a quite different version of your story than what I had imagined." Elena maintained a neutral expression, though her heart accelerated. "And what exactly had you imagined?" "Honestly, that you were an opportunist who had found a way to manipulate my father." Emily shrugged with raw frankness. "I've seen too many people try it over the years." "Understandable," Elena conceded. "Distrust is a natural response when you've seen patterns repeat. Emily seemed slightly surprised by this response. Most would have been offended by my assumption. Most haven't been through what you have, I suppose. Growing up with wealth and privilege carries its own challenges, especially regarding the authenticity of relationships. Emily looked at her with renewed interest. Exactly. You never know if someone likes you for who you are or for what you represent. She paused reflectively. Though I suppose you've experienced both extremes, being valued for your mind and then being invisible. Invisibility has its advantages, Eleanor responded with a slight smile. It allows you to observe people as they truly are, without the masks they wear when they know they're being seen. A contemplative silence settled between them. Elena sensed they were having a deeper conversation than the words suggested, a mutual recognition of shared experiences from opposite perspectives. Margaret told me about your ex-husband, Emily finally continued, about how he destroyed your career with false accusations, and how when your innocence was finally proven, you'd already disappeared. Eleanor nodded slowly. Life rarely offers perfectly timed vindications. She also mentioned you had a daughter, Emily added, her tone softening slightly. Possibly that was the reason why you didn't fight harder. Jessica, Eleanor confirmed, allowing herself a genuine smile. She has been my North Star, my reason for every decision, even those that meant giving up important parts of myself. Emily studied the graduation photo on the desk. She looks like you. Same eyes. But she has her father's determination for better or worse. My mother died when I was 12, Emily said abruptly, surprising Eleanor with this personal revelation. Cancer. Since then it's been just my father and me. He changed after losing her. He became harder, more focused on business success. As if building something tangible could compensate for what we had lost. Eleanor felt a wave of compassion for this young woman who, behind her facade of toughness and privilege, carried her own wounds. Pain transforms us, she said softly. Some hide in work, others in anonymity. Different strategies for the same fear, being hurt again. Emily looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something close to respect. You're different from what I expected. So are you, Elena responded sincerely. A knock on the door interrupted their moment of connection. David poked his head in, his expression subtly changing when he saw Emily. Excuse the interruption. Emily, your father is looking for you. Something about the presentation for the board of directors. Thank you, David, Emily replied, standing up. She turned to Elena. We'll continue this conversation another time. When Emily left, David remained at the door, observing Elena with a disturbing intensity. Seems you've won over another Wilson, he commented with a smile that contained no humor. Impressive, considering how protective Emily is of her father. It's not about winning over anyone, David, Eleanor replied calmly, just about finding common understanding. Of course. His tone was soft, but loaded with insinuations. I just wonder what Robert would think if he knew everything about your past, not just the convenient parts you've shared. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. What exactly are you insinuating? David shrugged with fake innocence. Nothing in particular, just that we all have deeper secrets than we appear to, even you, Elena, the perfect polyglot. Before she could respond, David continued. By the way, important documentation arrived regarding the Gulf Coast project. Robert wants you to review it personally before tomorrow's video conference. He handed her a folder and left with the same disturbing smile, leaving Elena with the uncomfortable feeling that David knew, or thought he knew, something she had kept hidden. That night in her apartment, Eleanor spread the documentation across the kitchen table while Jessica prepared pasta, a Friday ritual they had maintained even after her daughter moved to a shared apartment near the medical school. Anything interesting? Jessica asked, stirring the sauce that bubbled on the stove. Elena frowned, studying the contracts with professional attention. There's something strange in these environmental clauses. They seem deliberately ambiguous regarding responsibilities in case of negative ecological impact. Do you think it's a mistake? Elena slowly shook her head. Ambiguities in contracts are rarely accidental, especially when they clearly benefit one of the parties. She continued reviewing the documentation while Jessica served dinner. As she delved deeper into the technical annexes, a growing unease settled in her mind. The environmental impact projections seemed excessively optimistic, almost unrealistic considering the fragility of the Gulf Coast ecosystem. "Mom, are you okay?" Jessica's worried voice pulled her from her thoughts. Eleanor realized she had been contemplating the same document for several minutes, her food cooling untouched. "Sorry, honey. It's just, these reports don't match what Robert has been communicating to me about the project's environmental commitment." Jessica looked at her curiously. "Do you think he's deceiving you?" "No," Eleanor replied reflexively. "Robert is many things, but not dishonest, at least not intentionally." "Then what do you think?" Eleanor considered the possibilities. "I think someone is manipulating the information that reaches him. These technical reports are written so that the conclusions seem positive, but the underlying data tells a different story." Jessica softly whistled. "Sounds like someone is playing a dangerous game." "Very dangerous," Elena confirmed, remembering David's strange attitude when delivering the documentation. "And I think I know who might be behind it." As they cleared the plates, Jessica casually asked, "By the way, how's everything going with Mr. CEO? Is he still as intimidating as you said?" Elena smiled, thinking about her recent evolution with Robert, about the moments of complicity they had shared, about the barriers that were slowly vanishing between them. "It's complicated," she finally responded. "Robert is a man of contrasts. Hard in business but surprisingly vulnerable at certain moments. He built this facade of the relentless executive, but sometimes I see glimpses of the real man behind the mask." Jessica observed her with a knowing smile. "Sounds like you like him." "Jessica!" Elena felt an unexpected blush rising to her cheeks. "He's my boss. Our relationship is strictly professional." Jessica murmured with exaggerated skepticism. "That's why you blush like a schoolgirl when you talk about him." Eleanor tried to protest but found herself laughing instead. "You're impossible. And you're transparent, Mom. At least to me." Jessica squeezed her hand affectionately. "After all you've sacrificed over the years, you deserve something good, even if it comes in the form of a handsome and complicated CEO." Later, while Jessica slept in her old room, Elena continued reviewing the documentation, increasingly convinced that something wasn't right. The Gulf Coast project, presented as a clean energy initiative with minimal environmental impact, seemed to hide significant risks for an already vulnerable ecosystem. Her phone vibrated with a text message. It was Robert. "Have you reviewed the Gulf Coast documentation? I have some doubts about the impact report that I'd like to discuss with you." Elena smiled slightly. Perhaps Robert Wilson was more perceptive than David had anticipated. She simply replied, "I have doubts too. Let's talk tomorrow." As she turned off the light, Eleanor reflected on how her life had changed in just 2 months, from being invisible to being at the center of corporate decisions that would affect thousands of people, from hiding her abilities to using them again with purpose, and perhaps most surprisingly, from fearing being discovered to beginning to truly show herself, layers of protection falling one after another. She wondered what else the path she had embarked on would reveal, not only about the corporate secrets she was beginning to glimpse, but about herself and about the enigmatic man who, without intending to, had rescued her from the shadows. Robert's office was bathed in the golden light of dawn when Elena arrived, much earlier than the usual schedule. She had spent much of the night analyzing the Gulf Coast project documentation, identifying discrepancies and contradictions that became more alarming the more she examined them. To her surprise, Robert was already there. His jacket carelessly hung on the back of his chair, and his shirt sleeves rolled up as he studied the same documents spread across his large desk. "Good morning," she greeted, pausing at the door. Robert looked up, his expression revealing an equally restless night. "Elena, thank you for coming so early." "Your message suggested urgency," she replied, entering and placing her own set of documents, now full of annotations and marks, on the desk. Robert pointed to the papers before him. "Something doesn't add up in these reports. The environmental impact projections seem too optimistic, considering previous studies on the ecosystem's fragility." Elena nodded, pleasantly surprised by his perception. "Exactly, and there's more. The technical annexes in Italian and French contain environmental liability clauses that differ subtly from the Spanish and English versions." "Differ how?" Robert asked, suddenly alert. Eleanor extracted the relevant pages from her folder. "In the Spanish and English versions, Ecotech assumes responsibility for impacts directly attributable to the installation, but in the Italian and French versions, the phrase is translated as impacts that can be exclusively linked to the installation. A crucial difference from a legal standpoint, Robert murmured, frowning. Practically impossible to prove exclusivity in such a complex ecosystem. Exactly. And these discrepancies appear systematically throughout the documentation, always favoring the company in the versions that fewer people would likely review. Robert stood up, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that Eleanor had learned to recognize as a sign of deep concern. "This isn't accidental," he finally said. "Someone deliberately manipulated these translations to create legal loopholes." Eleanor hesitated before posing the inevitable question. "Who supervised the translations?" Robert's eyes met hers, and Elena saw in them the same name she suspected. "David coordinated the entire process. He hired the translation agency and reviewed the final documents before presenting them to me." A heavy silence settled between them as the implications sank in. Eleanor observed emotions cross Robert's face: disbelief, disappointment, and finally, cold resolution. "This could have been catastrophic," he finally said. "Not just for the ecosystem, but for Ecotech's reputation. All our work positioning the company as a leader in sustainability, destroyed by, what? Greed, negligence, or pressure," Elena suggested. "Who else is involved in this project? Who would benefit from an accelerated implementation with fewer environmental restrictions?" Robert looked at her with renewed interest. "The main investor is Green Future Holdings. Their representative is James Coleman," Elena completed. "Emily's husband." Robert's expression hardened. "I need to talk to David and to James." "Wait," Elena intervened, placing a hand on his arm in an instinctive gesture. "Before confronting them, we need to fully understand the scope of this. If they've really been manipulating official documentation, they could have carefully covered their tracks." Robert considered her words, the tension visible in every line of his face. Elena could feel the betrayal he was experiencing, especially involving David, his trusted assistant for years, and James, his son-in-law. "You're right," he finally conceded. "We need irrefutable evidence." He looked at the documents scattered between them. "Can you review all the project documentation? Look for other discrepancies, any pattern that confirms systematic manipulation." "Of course. But we should obtain the original documents directly from the translation agency, not the versions David delivered." Robert nodded, appreciating her foresight. "I'll take care of that." Discreetly. They worked in silence for the next hour, meticulously reviewing each document, gradually building a map of inconsistencies that was becoming increasingly incriminating. "Robert," Elena finally said, looking up from a particularly problematic set of financial projections, "this goes beyond misleading translations. The return on investment figures have been systematically inflated in the reports for investors, while the environmental costs have been minimized. How is it possible I didn't detect this before?" Robert's question seemed directed more at himself than at her. Eleanor chose her words carefully, aware of the vulnerability Robert was showing. "CEOs depend on the information provided to them. If someone you trust selectively filters what reaches your desk—" "Trust," Robert murmured bitterly. "A luxury I apparently can't afford." "You can trust people," Elena responded gently. "You just need to carefully choose who." Their gazes met and something indefinable passed between them, a mutual recognition that amid this crisis of trust, they had found something genuine in each other. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. Emily entered without waiting for a response, stopping abruptly at seeing the scene. Her father and Elena surrounded by documents, clearly immersed in something important. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her gaze alternating between them with curiosity. "Actually, your timing is perfect," Robert replied, maintaining a neutral tone. "We were reviewing some aspects of the Gulf Coast project." Emily approached, observing the documents with professional interest. As corporate relations director, she was familiar with the company's major projects. "Any problems?" she asked, catching the tension in the atmosphere. Robert and Elena exchanged a quick glance, a silent conversation about how much to reveal. Elena nodded subtly, encouraging him to be honest. "We found some discrepancies in the documentation," Robert carefully explained. Translations that don't match between languages, projections that seem too optimistic. Emily's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor noticed a slight hardening in her posture. "What kind of discrepancies?" Eleanor intervened, maintaining a professional tone. "Subtle but significant differences in the environmental liability clauses. The Spanish version says one thing, while the Italian effectively says the opposite." "Strange," Emily commented, her voice perfectly controlled. "And who supervised these translations?" "David," Robert replied, closely watching his daughter's reaction. "And I understand James has been very involved in this project from Green Future Holdings." Something changed in Emily's expression, a flash of something, concern, recognition, quickly suppressed. "James mentions the project frequently," she confirmed cautiously. "He says it could be transformational for the region." "It would be," Robert responded, "but not in the way it's been presented. According to these documents, the environmental impact could be significantly higher than we've been led to believe, and the legal responsibilities in case of ecological damage have been diluted." Emily remained silent for a moment, processing this information. Eleanor perceived the internal conflict she must be experiencing, loyalty to her husband against the integrity she valued professionally. "Are you suggesting James is implicated in some kind of manipulation?" she finally asked, her voice controlled but with a defensive edge. "We're not suggesting anything yet," Robert responded carefully. "Just investigating discrepancies that shouldn't exist." Emily seemed about to argue, but at that moment the door opened again and David entered, stopping with evident surprise at finding the three gathered. "Excuse me," he said, quickly recovering his professional composure. "I didn't know you were in a meeting." Eleanor observed how his eyes swiftly scanned the documents spread across the desk, recognizing them and calculating the implications of their exposure. "David," Robert said with a calm that Elena knew cost him to maintain, "we were reviewing the documentation for the Gulf Coast project. There are some inconsistencies I'd like to discuss with you." David's smile faltered barely perceptibly. "Of course. What inconsistencies?" Robert pointed to the problematic translations Elena had identified. "The versions in different languages don't match at critical points, always in a way that benefits the company at the expense of environmental responsibility." David examined the documents with an expression of surprise that seemed too perfect to be genuine. "This is very concerning. It must be an error by the translation agency. I expressly requested absolute precision." "And the inflated financial projections," Robert pressed. "Are those translation errors too?" David's professional mask began to crack. "Robert, you know I only coordinate. The numbers come from the finance department and Green Future's advisors. I simply compile the information." "How convenient," Emily murmured, surprising everyone with her critical intervention. "No one is responsible because everyone just coordinates or compiles." David gave her a sharp look. "Perhaps you should ask your husband about those numbers. After all, he was the one who insisted we use his projections instead of our department's." The silence that followed was electric. Eleanor observed how Robert processed this new information, how Emily slightly paled, how David seemed instantly regretful of having revealed too much in a moment of defensiveness. "I think," Robert finally said, his voice calm but with undeniable authority, "that we need an immediate meeting. David, contact James. I want him here in an hour. Also the head of the legal department and our sustainability director." David nodded, clearly recognizing the gravity of the situation. "Of course. And David," Robert added as he headed toward the door, "don't make me come looking for you if you decide this meeting isn't convenient for you." When David left, Emily remained, her posture rigid and her expression indecipherable. "Dad," she began, but Robert raised a hand to stop her. "Don't jump to conclusions yet, Emily. Let's wait until we have all the facts." "James wouldn't do anything illegal," she insisted, though Eleanor detected a note of uncertainty in her voice. "He's ambitious, yes, but not dishonest." Robert sighed, suddenly appearing older. "Sometimes the line between ambition and dishonesty becomes blurred, especially when there are millions at stake." Emily looked at Elena, as if seeking an impartial ally. "What do you think?" Eleanor chose her words carefully. "I think we're facing a pattern of manipulation too sophisticated to be accidental. But as your father says, let's wait to hear all explanations before judging." Emily nodded slowly, her expression turning resolute. "I want to be in that meeting." "Emily," Robert began with a cautious tone. "It's my right," she interrupted. "As corporate relations director and as James's wife, I need to hear what he has to say." Robert exchanged a glance with Elena, who nodded imperceptibly. "All right," he finally conceded. "But remember that this is first a business matter, not personal." When Emily left to prepare for the meeting, Robert collapsed into his chair, the facade of control momentarily yielding. "This could destroy my relationship with my daughter," he murmured. Elena approached, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Or it could strengthen it. Truth, however painful, is usually the path to more authentic relationships." Robert covered her hand with his, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. "Thank you, Elena. Not just for discovering this, but for being here." The intimacy of the moment surprised them both, a connection that transcended the professional and entered territory neither had anticipated when Elena raised her hand in that conference room months ago. "We should prepare for the meeting," Elena said softly, though without withdrawing her hand. Robert nodded, his eyes still fixed on hers. "Yes, we should." As they organized the documentation, selecting the most compelling evidence, Elena reflected on how truth, so long buried in her own life, seemed to be emerging in all directions simultaneously. The layers of protection, the carefully guarded secrets, the constructed identities, all beginning to crumble under the relentless pressure of authenticity. The upcoming meeting would not only determine the future of the Gulf Coast project, but potentially redefine the relationships between all involved, revealing truths that some had tried to hide between the lines of apparently innocuous contracts and reports. And as Robert and she worked side by side, Elena wondered if perhaps the greatest discovery might not be in the documents they were examining so meticulously, but in the unexpected connection that had arisen between two people who had dedicated years to hiding their true selves from the world. The boardroom on the executive floor vibrated with barely contained tension. Robert presided at the table, his expression impenetrable as those summoned took their seats. Elena, to his right, maintained a professional posture, though internally she processed each reaction, each exchanged glance, each revealing gesture. David had returned with a visibly irritated James Coleman, annoyed by the urgent summons. Tall, athletic, with an impeccable suit and the confidence characteristic of someone accustomed to getting his way, James greeted Robert with a familiarity that now seemed forced. "Robert, I hope this is important. I cancelled a meeting with foreign investors to be here," he said, leaning to kiss Emily on the cheek before taking a seat beside her. Elena noticed the tension in Emily, how she barely responded to her husband's affectionate gesture, keeping her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her. "I assure you it's of utmost importance," Robert replied in a neutral tone. "Thank you for coming, Alan," he added, addressing the legal director who had just entered, followed by Teresa Vidal, Sustainability Director, a woman with a serious expression who seemed as confused by the summons as the others. Once all were seated, Robert got straight to the point. "I've called this meeting because we've discovered significant irregularities in the Gulf Coast project documentation," he began, his voice measured but firm. "Discrepancies that could have serious legal, environmental, and reputational consequences." James visibly tensed, while David maintained a carefully neutral expression. "What kind of discrepancies?" asked Alan, the legal director, leaning forward with professional interest. Robert nodded to Elena, giving her the floor. She methodically deployed the evidence they had gathered that morning. "The translations of the environmental liability clauses differ substantially between languages," she explained, showing the comparative documents. "In Spanish and English, Ecotech assumes responsibility for impacts directly attributable to the installation. In Italian and French, the responsibility is limited to impacts that can be exclusively linked to the installation, a critical legal distinction." Alan examined the documents with a grave expression. "This is extremely problematic. Exclusivity in environmental causality is practically impossible to demonstrate. Additionally," Elena continued, "the environmental impact projections presented in the executive reports are significantly more optimistic than the underlying technical data." She slid another set of documents. "Here, the original technical report indicates a considerable risk to migratory species, while the executive summary reduces it to minimal temporary impact." Teresa Vidal, the Sustainability Director, took the reports with evident alarm. "These aren't the data my department provided. Our assessments were much more cautious." Robert observed the reactions around the table, especially those of James and David. "The most concerning thing is that these discrepancies follow a consistent pattern, minimizing risks, exaggerating benefits, and diluting legal responsibilities, all to accelerate the approval and implementation of the project." James was the first to break the tense silence that followed. "Robert, clearly there's been some misunderstanding. Green Future Holdings fully trusts Ecotech's integrity. Perhaps there were communication errors between teams." "These weren't communication errors," Robert interrupted coldly. "They were deliberate manipulations. The question is, who ordered them and why?" All eyes moved between David and James. Eleanor perceived the exact moment when both men understood they were cornered, their body language subtly changing from defensive to calculating. "David coordinated all translations and compiled the final reports," Robert pointed out. "And James insisted that we use Green Future's financial projections instead of our own estimates." David raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "I just followed instructions, Robert. James was very specific about which versions should be presented and how certain terms should be translated." "That's absurd," James exclaimed, hitting the table. "You can't blame me for translation errors. I don't even speak Italian or French." "But you hired who translated them," David countered. "And you gave me precise instructions about which projections should be included. You said it was crucial to secure funding." Emily watched the exchange with an increasingly horrified expression. "James," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper, "is it true?" James looked at his wife, his expression fluctuating between indignation and calculation. "Emily, this is ridiculous. They're misrepresenting normal business conversations to cover their own mistakes." "Then you'll have no problem with us reviewing all emails and messages related to the project," Alan, the legal director, intervened, "to clarify exactly who said what to whom." James's face lost color, while David seemed increasingly uncomfortable. "This is unnecessary," James protested. "We're talking about one of the most important projects for both companies. Instead of looking for culprits, we should focus on correcting any errors and moving forward." "These aren't errors," Robert declared firmly, "and we won't move forward with a project based on lies, no matter how profitable it might be." The room fell silent. Eleanor observed Emily, whose expression had transformed from horror to determination. "How much, James?" Emily suddenly asked. "What?" Her husband looked at her in confusion. "How much were you going to personally gain if this project was approved under these conditions? What commission or bonus was at stake?" James paled even more, involuntarily confirming Emily's suspicions. "It's not just about money," he murmured, changing strategy. "It's about opportunity. This project could transform the region, create jobs, while destroying a protected ecosystem," Teresa Vidal completed with disdain, "and leaving Ecotech with the legal responsibility when everything goes wrong." James turned to Robert, adopting a more conciliatory tone. "Robert, we've been family for 5 years. You know I would never do anything to intentionally harm Ecotech. Yes, perhaps I was too optimistic with some projections, but you deliberately manipulated critical information," Robert completed. "You used your family connection to influence corporate decisions. And you dragged David into your scheme. David, seeing the ship sinking, decided to save himself. I have all the emails, Robert. James was explicit about what changes he wanted and why. He assured me that you were aware, that it was part of a negotiation strategy." "Liar," James exclaimed, finally losing his composure. "You were the one who suggested we could adjust the translations to facilitate approvals. You said no one would review the Italian or French versions in detail." Eleanor observed the exchange of accusations, with a mixture of disgust and fascination at how quickly masks fell when people felt cornered. "Enough," Robert intervened, his voice cutting the air like a knife. "Alan, I want a complete legal analysis of our current exposure and options to rectify the situation. Teresa, I need an honest report on the true environmental impact this project would have." Both executives nodded, clearly relieved to have concrete tasks amid the chaos. "And us?" David asked, his usual confidence completely evaporated. Robert looked at him with a coldness Elena had never seen in him. "You're suspended until an internal investigation is completed. Turn in your access card and passwords to Human Resources before leaving today." David paled but nodded, recognizing it could have been worse. "And James?" Emily asked, her voice tense but firm. Robert looked at his son-in-law and then at his daughter. "That's both a business and personal decision. As far as Ecotech is concerned, Green Future Holdings will be officially notified of the discovered irregularities and our decision to completely reconsider the project's terms." James rose abruptly. "This is a mistake, Robert. There's too much at stake." "Exactly," Robert responded. "Too much. Our integrity, our environmental responsibility, our partners' trust. Not everything reduces to quarterly profits, James." With a final furious look at everyone in the room, especially Elena, James left. David followed shortly after, defeated. When only Robert, Elena, and Emily remained, silence weighed like lead. Emily seemed stunned, processing the implications not only professionally but personally of what she had just witnessed. "I'm sorry, Emily," Robert finally said. "I wish I could have protected you from this." Emily slowly shook her head. "I don't need protection, Dad. I need truth. Always." She looked at Elena with an indecipherable expression. "Thank you for discovering this. Not many people would have risked exposing something like this." Elena nodded, acknowledging what those words meant coming from Emily. Truth always emerges eventually, better that it be on our terms than others. Emily stood, gathering her dignity like a cloak. "I need time to think. About many things." She looked at her father. "But I'm proud of your decision, Dad. It's the right one." When Emily left, Robert exhaled deeply, as if he had been holding his breath. "That was necessary," Elena completed gently, "and brave." Robert looked at her with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "It wouldn't have happened without you. Any other interpreter would have overlooked those discrepancies or attributed them to translation errors." "I'm not any interpreter," Elena responded with a small smile. "No," Robert agreed, his gaze intensifying. "You definitely are not Elena Martinez." They looked at each other for a long moment, the tension of the confrontation transforming into something different, more personal and profound. "What next?" Elena finally asked. Robert sighed, reluctantly returning to reality. "Restructuring. We obviously need a new executive assistant. And someone to oversee all the company's intercultural communications." "Someone like a director of intercultural communication?" Elena suggested. "Exactly," Robert confirmed with a tired but genuine smile. "Someone who understands that true communication goes beyond words, who captures nuances and intentions behind them. Someone I can trust completely." The implication of his words hung between them, an offer and something more, an invitation to territory that transcended the professional. "Sounds like a great responsibility," Elena responded, aware of the weight of the moment. "It is," Robert confirmed. "Are you interested?" Elena considered everything that had happened in the past months. Her transformation from invisible woman to a key piece in a multinational company, the rediscovery of her long-suppressed skills and passions, and this unexpected connection with a man who, like her, had lived behind layers of protection that slowly vanished. "Yes," she finally responded, with a clarity that surprised them both. "I'm interested." "In all that implies." Robert extended his hand across the table, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. Eleanor took it, sealing not just a professional agreement, but the beginning of something new, something based not on appearances or conveniences, but on the truth they had both discovered, both about the world around them and about themselves. Eleanor's office had acquired a new dimension in the weeks following the confrontation. She now occupied a spacious corner office opposite Robert's, with large windows offering a complimentary view of the New York skyline. The decor, elegant but functional, included bookshelves filled with specialized dictionaries, literary works in multiple languages, and her own academic books, now prominently displayed instead of hidden. But the most significant change wasn't in the physical space, but in how she moved within it. No longer as a temporary intruder or an anomaly, but as someone who had reclaimed her legitimate place in the world. Elena was reviewing drafts of the official communication about the redesign of the Gulf Coast project when her phone vibrated with a message from Margaret Davis, her former university colleague. "Incredible news! Columbia University is offering the Garcia Lorca Chair of Intercultural Communication. The committee specifically wants you. Prestigious position, funded research, flexible schedule. Call me urgently. Elena stared at the message, a mixture of contradictory emotions stirring within her. The Garcia Lorca chair was exactly the type of position that would have been the dream of her previous life, the perfect culmination of the academic career that had been so abruptly interrupted. A gentle knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Jessica peeked in, smiling. "Am I interrupting something important, Director?" she joked, entering with a small plant in a decorative pot. "Never for you," Elena replied, putting away the phone. "What have you brought?" "A gift for your office," Jessica explained, placing the plant by the window. "I thought you needed something living in this corporate temple." Elena observed her daughter with infinite pride. In her white resident doctor's coat, with the stethoscope peeking from her pocket, Jessica represented everything that had been worthwhile in her long sacrifice. "It's perfect," she said, genuinely moved by the gesture. "How's your first month at the hospital going?" "Exhausting, terrifying, fascinating," Jessica replied, dropping into one of the chairs in front of the desk. "Exactly as I imagined." Eleanor smiled, remembering her own passion for academia at that age. "Life rarely gives us exactly what we imagine, but sometimes it surprises us with something equally valuable." Jessica studied her mother with the insight that had always characterized her. "You seem worried. Problems with the project?" Eleanor hesitated, considering whether to share the news from the university. She finally decided that Jessica deserved to know all her options. "I just received an offer from Columbia University, the Garcia Lorca Chair of Intercultural Communication." Jessica's eyes widened. "Mom, that's huge. The Garcia Lorca Chair is super prestigious. Are you going to accept it?" "I don't know," Elena confessed. "It's an extraordinary opportunity, but here you also have something valuable," Jessica completed, her gaze becoming more perceptive. "And not just professionally." Eleanor felt a slight blush rise to her cheeks, still surprised by how transparent she was to her daughter. During the past weeks, her relationship with Robert had gradually evolved from strictly professional toward something more personal. Occasional dinners to discuss projects that extended long after work topics were exhausted, conversations that ventured into increasingly intimate territories, a connection that deepened with each layer of protection they both let fall. "Robert is important," she finally admitted. "Oh, we share something I didn't expect to find at this stage of my life." Jessica smiled without mockery, just with genuine happiness. "Your face lights up when you talk about him. I haven't seen you like this well, never." Elena fidgeted with a pen on her desk. "It's complicated. We have complex histories, emotional baggage, intertwined professional responsibilities. And yet, here you are," Jessica observed. "Two people who found each other when they least expected it." "You sound like a romantic novelist, not a scientific doctor," Eleanor joked. "Science also appreciates improbable but significant phenomena," Jessica replied with a smile. Then, more seriously, "What do you want to do, Mom? Not what you think you should do, but what you truly desire." The question reverberated within Elena with unexpected intensity. For so many years, her decisions had been dictated by necessity, duty, survival. She had rarely allowed herself the luxury of considering her own desires. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "Academia was my home once, but this corporate world, which I never imagined inhabiting, has offered me challenges and satisfactions I didn't anticipate. And then there's Robert." "Why can't you have both?" Jessica suggested. "The chair could be part-time combined with your work here." Elena considered the possibility. "It would be intense." "Like everything worth having," Jessica replied, rising to hug her mother. "Just remember that, after all these years caring for me and sacrificing yourself, you deserve to choose what makes you happy, whatever that is." After Jessica left, Eleanor remained contemplating the newly gifted plant, a symbol of growth and new possibilities. The dilemma before her wasn't simply professional, but deeply personal. Return to the academic world that once defined her, remain in this new corporate territory she had come to value, or try to create a bridge between both worlds. That same afternoon, Eleanor found herself walking across Columbia University's campus, the red brick buildings and tree-lined plazas, awakening a nostalgia she hadn't anticipated. Margaret was waiting for her on a bench under a flowering magnolia. "Eleanor!" she exclaimed, hugging her effusively. "How wonderful to see you here. You look different in a good way." I feel different, Elena admitted, sitting next to her former colleague. It's been a year of unexpected transformations. And it could be even more transformative, Margaret responded enthusiastically. The Garcia Lorca chair is perfect for you. Interdisciplinary research, reduced teaching, international projects. And the committee is willing to be flexible with schedules if you have other commitments. Elena listened as Margaret detailed the position, each aspect sounding more attractive than the previous. It was as if academia were offering her not just a triumphant return, but a complete vindication after years of injustice. It sounds extraordinary, Elena conceded, but I don't know if I can leave Ecotech now. We've initiated important projects, and my position there is also significant. Margaret looked at her curiously. Is it just the work that ties you to that company, or is there something more? Eleanor smiled at her friend's insight. Let's say I've found valuable connections there. The famous Robert Wilson, Margaret asked with a conspiratorial smile. University rumors work surprisingly well, even about the corporate world. It's complicated, Elena replied, neither confirming nor denying. Love generally is, Margaret observed, but that doesn't mean you should sacrifice your academic ambitions. Elena, you were one of the brightest minds of our generation. Academia needs you. They walked across the campus while discussing possibilities. Elena felt the attraction of the university world, the intellectually stimulating environment, the opportunity to influence new generations. But she also perceived that something had changed in her, that she was no longer exclusively the academic she once was. When do they need my answer? She finally asked. The committee meets in 2 weeks, Margaret replied, but between you and me, the position is yours if you want it. They're just waiting for your decision. As they said goodbye, Margaret added, Eleanor, whatever your choice, I'm glad the world is recognizing your value again. We always knew you were extraordinary, even when you yourself forgot it. Evening was falling when Elena returned to Ecotech. The building, which months ago she had cleaned floor by floor, now represented an integral part of her reconstructed identity. She found Robert in his office, reviewing documents with the intense concentration that characterized him. How was your mysterious, personal commitment? He asked upon seeing her, with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. Eleanor closed the door, suddenly feeling nervous. I had a meeting at Columbia University. Robert set aside the documents, giving her his full attention. University? Sounds intriguing. They've offered me a chair, Elena explained, sitting across from him, the Garcia Lorca chair of intercultural communication. Robert looked at her intently, processing the information. That's impressive. Congratulations. His tone was sincere, though Elena perceived an underlying note of concern. Thank you. It's an opportunity I never thought I'd have again, she replied, studying his reaction. Research, reduced teaching, international projects. It's the type of position I dreamed of before everything changed in my life. Robert nodded slowly, resting his elbows on the desk. It sounds perfect for you. A recognition of your true worth. A silence extended between them, laden with unexpressed implications. Eleanor could feel Robert's effort to maintain a neutral, professional expression. Have you decided to accept it? He finally asked, his voice deliberately controlled. Eleanor sighed, facing the complexity of her feelings. No, it's a difficult decision. On one hand, it represents a kind of vindication, a return to the world that was unjustly taken from me. She paused, searching for the right words. On the other hand, what we've built here at Ecotech is also significant. The international projects, the real impact on sustainability, and the relationships I've developed. Their eyes met on that last phrase, communicating much more than the words expressed. Robert stood, walking to the window. The setting sun bathed New York in golden and reddish tones, a spectacle that normally captivated him, but that he now barely noticed. I don't want to be a factor in your decision, Elena, he finally said, turning his back to her. This is an opportunity you deserve that you've more than earned. Eleanor stood as well, approaching him. But you are a factor, Robert. I can't and don't want to pretend otherwise. Robert turned to look at her, the vulnerability rarely visible on his face now evident. These months with you have been transformative. The company, the projects, everything seems to have a clearer purpose. And personally, he stopped as if words were insufficient. I know, Eleanor responded softly. For me too. But I fear that if I ask you to stay, I'd be repeating the same mistake I made years ago, Robert confessed, surprising her with his frankness. Asking someone to sacrifice their dream for mine. You mean Emily? Eleanor asked, intuiting an untold story. Robert nodded. Emily was brilliant in art. She had a scholarship to study in Paris. But after her mother died, I indirectly asked her to stay to study business to eventually join the company. His voice tightened with regret. I never explicitly asked her, but she felt the obligation, and although she's exceptional in her work, she gave up her passion, Elena completed, understanding the magnitude of his conflict. Exactly. I can't make the same mistake with you. It wouldn't be fair. Elena took his hand, a simple but intimate gesture. There's a crucial difference, Robert. Emily was very young, just beginning her path. I'm at a different point in my life, with enough experience to know that rarely are decisions simply between right and wrong. Robert looked at her intensely. What are you saying? That perhaps I don't have to choose between black and white. Margaret mentioned that the committee is willing to be flexible with schedules. Maybe there's a way to honor both parts of who I am now. A spark of hope illuminated Robert's eyes. A hybrid solution? Academia and company? Possibly, Elena conceded. But I need time to reflect, to ensure that whatever decision I make is sustainable in the long term, for both of us. Robert nodded, respecting her process. Of course. And I want you to know that, whatever your decision, you have my complete support. As the sun disappeared on the New York horizon, Eleanor contemplated the options before her. It wasn't simply a choice between past and present, between academia and company, but an opportunity to redefine who Elena Martinez truly was after so many years of hiding. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the freedom to choose not from fear or necessity, but from the strength and newly discovered authenticity. The official proposal from Columbia University arrived in Elena's hands a week later, an elegant envelope containing not only the terms of the Garcia Lorca chair, but also a personal letter from the president expressing how significant her return to the academic world would be. Elena placed the envelope on her apartment table alongside another equally important document, a proposal from Robert to restructure her position at Ecotech, creating an international communication and culture department under her direction, with schedule flexibility that potentially would allow her to combine both positions. Jessica observed her mother from the sofa, respecting her space as she processed these options. Both are extraordinary offers, Elena finally commented, breaking the silence. They are, Jessica agreed, and both reflect how much they value you in these such different worlds. Elena smiled with a certain irony. It's strange. For years I was invisible, deliberately anonymous. Now suddenly everyone wants Elena Martinez full-time. It's not that strange, Jessica replied, with the wisdom that always surprised Elena. Authenticity has a magnetic power. When you finally allowed yourself to be who you really are, the world responded. Elena contemplated her daughter's words, recognizing their profound truth. Her transformation hadn't really begun when she raised her hand in that conference room, but when she dropped the fear that had kept her hidden for so many years. There's something else complicating my decision, Elena admitted, pouring herself a cup of tea. Something I discovered yesterday while reviewing old documentation from the Gulf Coast project. Jessica leaned forward, intrigued. What did you find? Elena extracted a folder from her briefcase. When we were investigating the irregularities, we focused on the manipulated environmental clauses, but we didn't completely follow the money trail. It turns out that part of the initial funding for Ecotech 15 years ago came from a government fund designated to support immigrant communities. And? Jessica frowned, not understanding the implication. The fund was specifically assigned for educational and cultural programs in neighborhoods with high immigrant populations, but it was redirected to seed capital for innovative companies, including Robert's startup. Elena passed the documents to Jessica. Technically legal but ethically questionable, that money should have financed schools' integration programs, cultural centers, like those that could have benefited our community, Jessica completed, finally understanding. Do you think Robert knew? Eleanor slowly shook her head. I don't think so. This reassignment was managed by politicians and bureaucrats. Robert probably just saw a legitimate funding opportunity for his vision of sustainable energy. But now you know, Jessica observed, "and this complicates your relationship with him." "And my decision about the chair," Elena added. "If I accept the academic position, I could formally investigate how these funds were diverted. I could generate changes in future policies, ensure that communities receive what belongs to them." Jessica studied her mother with renewed understanding. "It's not just about your career, is it? It's about using your voice for those who are still invisible." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility. "For years, I convinced myself that hiding was the only option. But now I see that silence also has consequences, that sometimes the most necessary voice is precisely that of someone who understands both worlds." She stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the bustling street. Below, New York vibrated with life. Tourists, workers, families, a human tapestry of interwoven stories, many invisible to each other. "I need to talk to Robert," she finally decided, "about everything. The chair, the ecotech proposal, and these documents." Jessica looked at her with concern. "What if he reacts negatively? You could lose everything." Eleanor smiled with a serenity that surprised even herself. "If I can't be completely honest with him, what value would what we build together really have?" The restaurant Robert had chosen for their dinner was a small hidden gem in old Manhattan, far from the corporate world they inhabited during the day. With centuries-old stone walls, flickering candles, and an intimate atmosphere, it seemed designed for meaningful conversations. Elena arrived punctually, dressed with elegant simplicity. Robert was already waiting, his smile genuinely illuminating as he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said, rising to greet her with a kiss on the cheek that lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for suggesting this place," she responded, appreciating the rustic beauty of the surroundings. "It's perfect." The dinner began with light conversation, anecdotes from the day, comments on the excellent wine, observations about the historic plaza visible from their table, but both felt the gravity of pending decisions floating between them. Finally, after the main course, Robert took her hand across the table. "I've been thinking a lot about your decision, Elena, and I want you to know that, whatever it is, I'll support you completely." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. Eleanor squeezed his hand in response. "I know, and I value it immensely. But before we talk about my decision, there's something I must share with you." Carefully, she extracted the documents from her purse, placing them on the table. "I found this while reviewing files from the Gulf Coast project." Robert looked at the papers with curiosity, then with growing perplexity, as Elena explained her discovery about the diverted funds that had helped start Ecotech. "I had no idea," he murmured when she finished, consternation evident on his face. "When I received that initial funding, I only knew it was part of a government program for sustainable ventures. They never told me the money was originally destined for community programs." Elena studied his reaction, recognizing the sincere surprise and concern. "I believe you, Robert, but now that we know, the question is, what do we do with this information?" Robert reclined in his chair, processing the implications. Legally, Ecotech did nothing wrong. It was the government that reassigned those funds. He paused reflectively. "But ethically? Ethically, there's a debt to communities that never received the promised resources," Elena completed. "Communities like mine." Robert looked at her with renewed understanding. "This is why you're seriously considering the chair, to investigate these practices." "It's one of the factors," she admitted. "From that position, I could document how these fund diversions affect vulnerable populations. I could generate awareness, even policy changes." A contemplative silence extended between them as Robert fully absorbed the situation. Elena expected defensiveness, perhaps even anger, but what she saw was something different. Deep consideration, followed by resolution. "What if we could do something better than simply documenting the problem?" he finally proposed. "What if Ecotech created a foundation specifically to settle that ethical debt? Not just with donations, but with concrete programs, scholarships, cultural centers, educational support for immigrant communities." Elena looked at him surprised. "You would do that?" "It's not just about doing the right thing," Robert responded with growing passion. "It's an opportunity to transform a historical injustice into something constructive. Ecotech prospered thanks to those initial funds. It's fair that now, when we're successful, we give back with interest." Elena felt a wave of emotion at his response, so different from what she feared. It would be a significant project. That would need someone who deeply understands both worlds to lead it, Robert added, his eyes fixed on hers. Someone with academic and corporate experience. Someone who has lived the reality of these communities. The implication was clear, and Elena felt the weight of another possibility opening before her. Are you suggesting a third option? Robert confirmed. Not just academia, not just business, but something that combines the best of both worlds with a transformative purpose. Elena contemplated the proposal, glimpsing its potential. The university could be part of this. Applied research, educational programs, a bridge between worlds that rarely communicate. Robert nodded enthusiastically. Exactly the type of intercultural communication that defines your work. The idea grew between them, taking shape, acquiring dimensions that neither had anticipated at the beginning of the evening. It wasn't simply a solution to her personal dilemma, but something greater that could benefit countless people. It's ambitious, Elena acknowledged. Like everything worth having, Robert responded, unconsciously using the same words Jessica had employed days ago. Eleanor felt a growing clarity, as if the pieces of a complex puzzle finally fit together. Her journey from invisibility toward authenticity hadn't been just for her personal benefit, but to reach this precise moment, this specific crossroads, where her unique experience could generate a real impact. I would need to maintain certain independence, she reflected, beginning to seriously consider the proposal. The foundation should have autonomy from ecotech to maintain its integrity. Absolutely, Robert agreed. Total transparency, independent governance, long-term commitment. As they discussed the potential details, Eleanor observed this man who, months ago, she barely knew. The way he had received potentially uncomfortable information, not with defensiveness but with openness, not seeking excuses but solutions, revealed much about his character. You know what's most extraordinary about all this? She finally said, a smile illuminating her face. What? Robert asked, captivated by the intensity in her eyes. That it all began when an invisible woman decided to become visible, when someone who cleaned in silence decided to speak. Sometimes the simplest act of authenticity can trigger transformations we never would have imagined. Robert took her hand, his gaze communicating much more than words. True communication always begins with the courage to show ourselves as we truly are. Under the starry New York sky, as they outlined the contours of an unexpected but purposeful future, Elena felt she was completing a circle that had begun years ago. It wasn't a return to who she had been, nor a permanence in who she had been forced to be, but the emergence of an entirely new version of herself, authentic, integrated, and finally visible in all her complexity. Columbia University's auditorium vibrated with anticipatory energy. Academics in formal robes, corporate executives in elegant suits, eager students, and members of various immigrant communities from New York occupied every available seat, a human mosaic that rarely converged in the same space. On the stage, a simple podium awaited alongside a table where representatives from Ecotech, the university, and various community organizations waited for the event to begin. Robert, impeccable in a dark suit, exchanged comments with the university president. Emily, who in recent months had rebuilt her personal and professional life after her separation from James, efficiently reviewed the last details of the program with serene efficiency. Backstage, Elena breathed deeply, trying to calm the nerves she hadn't experienced in decades. The navy blue suit she had chosen for the occasion was professional yet welcoming, reflecting the duality of the worlds she now inhabited with growing comfort. Jessica approached, radiant in a formal dress that contrasted with the medical coat that now constituted her usual uniform. "You're ready," she affirmed, not as a question, but as a certainty, as she slightly adjusted her mother's necklace. Eleanor nodded, smiling. "Ready for a beginning I never imagined. The best beginnings are precisely those we cannot plan," Jessica replied with a smile. "As you once told me, life rarely follows clean and orderly trajectories." "Using my own words against me," Elena joked, hugging her daughter. "Thank you for believing in me, even when I doubted myself." "Always," Jessica responded simply. An assistant approached, indicating it was time. Eleanor took one last deep breath and walked toward the stage, where she was received with enthusiastic applause. Standing behind the podium, she observed the expectant faces before her, academic colleagues who had welcomed her back with open arms, the ecotech team who had come to deeply respect her perspective, curious students about this innovative collaboration, and, especially significant for Elena, immigrant families who represented the real impact the project sought to generate. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and firm. "Today we celebrate not only the formal inauguration of the Bridges Foundation, but a new model of collaboration between worlds that have traditionally operated in parallel without truly meeting." Her eyes found Robert's in the front row, who looked at her with pride that transcended the professional. Next to him, Margaret Davis smiled approvingly, while on the other side, Professor Watanabe, who had traveled especially from Japan for the event, nodded with satisfaction. This foundation is born from a simple but powerful idea, that true innovation occurs at intersections, in spaces where different perspectives, experiences, and knowledge meet and intertwine. Elena explained how the Bridges Foundation would combine rigorous academic research with practical corporate applications, all in service of communities that had historically remained at the margins of both worlds. She detailed the initial programs: scholarships for talented young immigrants, multilingual cultural centers, sustainable entrepreneurship incubators in disadvantaged neighborhoods, and an innovative research institute on intercultural communication. "As many know, my own path has been unconventional," she continued, allowing herself a vulnerability she would have previously avoided. "I've been a university professor and a cleaning woman, a recognized academic and an invisible immigrant, a theoretical linguist and a practical negotiator. For years, I lived these identities as irreconcilable contradictions, fragmented parts of myself that could never coexist." She paused, observing how her words visibly resonated among those who had experienced similar identity fragmentations. "Today I understand that these apparent contradictions are in reality my greatest strength, that it's precisely in the integration of these different experiences where my unique contribution resides. And I suspect many of you share similar stories, living in intermediate spaces, navigating multiple worlds simultaneously." Several heads nodded in recognition, especially among the immigrant audience. The Bridges Foundation honors those complex experiences. It recognizes that those who have crossed borders, geographical, linguistic, cultural, socioeconomic, possess a special intelligence, a unique capacity to build connections where others see only divisions. Elena explained how her dual role as Garcia Lorca Chair at the university and Director of the Bridges Foundation wasn't a concession or a compromise, but a structural innovation that would allow true knowledge transfer between traditionally isolated sectors. "This project wouldn't have been possible without the vision and commitment of many people," she acknowledged, directing a grateful look toward Robert, especially someone who, upon discovering a historical injustice in the origins of his own success, didn't seek excuses but transformative solutions, who understood that true reparation doesn't simply consist of compensating for the past, but creating opportunities for a more equitable future. Robert slightly inclined his head in acknowledgement, his expression a mixture of humility and determination. "I also want to thank my daughter, Jessica," Elena continued, her voice softening with emotion, "who never allowed me to forget my worth, even during the darkest years, who understood long before I did that our wounds and struggles are not obstacles to overcome, but sources of wisdom to share." Jessica, from her seat, sent her a discreet kiss, her eyes bright with pride. As Elena concluded her speech, a sensation of a completed circle enveloped her. The invisible woman who had mopped these same university hallways now stood before a packed auditorium, not just visible, but influential. It hadn't been a linear or conventional path, but a trajectory with unexpected curves, painful detours, and surprising intersections that, viewed in retrospect, formed a meaningful and coherent design. At the end of the formal ceremony, as the audience dispersed toward the reception area, Robert approached Eleanor, discreetly taking her hand in his. "You were magnificent," he said softly. "Inspiring. Thank you," she replied, feeling the familiar warmth his presence always evoked. "For this and for everything else." "It's just the beginning," he observed, his gaze sweeping over the diverse crowd now animatedly conversing, creating precisely the type of intercultural connections the Foundation sought to foster. Elena nodded, appreciating the truth in his words. The last 6 months had been intense. Negotiations with the university, legal structuring of the Foundation, reconciliation between Emily and Robert after the Gulf Coast Project scandal, and the gradual but significant development of her personal relationship with Robert. Each aspect represented not an end, but a threshold to new possibilities. They joined the reception, where Eleanor moved with natural elegance between different groups. Academics discussing research methodologies, executives exploring practical applications, students anxious for opportunities, immigrant families sharing their experiences. In each interaction, Elena adapted not just her language but her entire approach, building communicative bridges with the skill of someone who has inhabited multiple realities. In a quiet moment, Emily approached Eleanor with 2 glasses of champagne. "For the architect of all this," she said, offering her a glass. "I never imagined I'd be grateful for the day you appeared in that conference room." Eleanor smiled, accepting both the drink and the compliment. "Life has a strange sense of humor sometimes. And of justice," Emily added thoughtfully. "You know, after everything that happened with James, I wondered if I really had good judgment about people. If I could trust my instincts." She looked significantly toward her father, who was animatedly conversing with Professor Watanabe. "But seeing you with my father, how you've helped him reconnect not just with his professional purpose, but with parts of himself he had suppressed, gives me hope." "He has done the same for me," Eleanor acknowledged sincerely. "Sometimes the right people find us precisely when we're prepared to see ourselves through their eyes." Emily nodded, considering her words. "I'm thinking of applying for that art scholarship in Paris," she suddenly confessed. "The one I declined after Mom died." "Your father would be delighted," Eleanor responded, genuinely pleased. "It's never too late to reclaim parts of yourself you left behind." As the afternoon progressed, Elena finally found a moment to escape to a side terrace, needing a brief respite from the social bustle. The sun was beginning to descend, bathing New York in that characteristic golden light that transformed ordinary buildings into magical monuments. She felt more than heard Robert's presence joining her, a recognition that transcended the physical. "Too much socializing?" he asked with gentle understanding. Eleanor smiled. "Just recharging energies. It's been an intense day." "But good," Robert added, positioning himself beside her to contemplate the urban landscape. "Very good," Eleanor agreed. They remained in comfortable silence for a moment, enjoying the rare tranquility amid such a significant day. "I have something for you," Robert finally said, extracting a small object from his pocket. A symbol, perhaps too literal but meaningful. Eleanor looked at him with curiosity as he opened his hand to reveal a small antique key, elegantly restored and suspended from a delicate silver chain. "A key?" she asked, carefully taking it. "From Ecotech's first office," he explained. "I kept it as a reminder of where everything began. It seemed appropriate that it now be yours, a symbol of open doors and new beginnings." Elena felt the emotional weight of the object, appreciating the gesture not as a simple gift, but as a transfer of meaning, an invitation to a shared future. "It's perfect," she murmured, allowing Robert to place the chain around her neck. The key rested right over her heart, a tangible reminder that endings and beginnings are simply different perspectives of the same moment, that closed doors can reopen, and that interrupted paths can reconnect, transformed but recognizable. "Elena Martinez," Robert said softly, taking her hands in his. "The woman who speaks 7 languages, but whose deepest eloquence is in how she lives her truth. Thank you for allowing me to be part of your extraordinary story." "Thank you for helping me write the new chapters," she responded, the words simple, but laden with promise. As the setting sun gilded the city before them, Eleanor reflected on the improbable journey that had led her to this precise moment. From respected university professor to invisible cleaning woman, and now to a unique role that integrated all aspects of her experience. It wasn't a restoration of the past, nor a resignation to the present, but an authentic reinvention that honored every fragment of her history. The antique key on her chest seemed to capture that essential truth, that sometimes we must lose something precious to discover parts of ourselves we never would have known otherwise, that even the most painful detours can lead us to more meaningful destinations than those we had originally planned. As they returned together to the celebration, Eleanor understood that true translation, the art of carrying meaning from one world to another, didn't simply occur between languages, but between human experiences. And that her most valuable gift wasn't simply her facility with words, but her capacity to fully inhabit the space between worlds, building bridges where others saw only chasms. The invisible woman who had found her voice had not only changed her own life, but had initiated waves of transformation that would continue expanding far beyond what anyone could have imagined that morning, when, with racing heart and trembling hands, she had timidly raised her hand in a conference room and had simply said, "I can help,"